The air was thick with tension as Eliza Moore knelt beside the trembling German shepherd, Maya. The dim light of the barn cast long shadows across the straw-covered floor as Clara Bennett paced anxiously nearby, her fingers twisting together in nervous anticipation. Maya let out a low whimper, her body convulsing with the force of another contraction. Eliza's pulse quickened. She had delivered countless animals during her years as a military veterinarian, but something about this birth unsettled her. "Stay with me, girl," Eliza murmured, stroking Maya's damp fur. The dog's dark eyes, filled with pain and trust, met hers. Another contraction rippled through her body, and then finally the first puppy emerged. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. It was wrong. Instead of the warm, slick body of a healthy newborn, the tiny creature was covered in raw, angry lesions. Patches of fur were missing, revealing irritated, losing skin beneath. A sickly whimper escaped the newborn's mouth as Eliza instinctively scooped it into a clean towel, her trained hands moving automatically even as her mind reeled. "Oh my God," Clara gasped, taking a step closer. "What's wrong with it?" Eliza didn't answer. She was too busy running through every possible medical explanation in her head: genetic disorder, infection, environmental poisoning, but none of them quite fit. Her gut told her something else was at play, something far worse than a simple medical condition. Maya let out another strained cry, and Eliza refocused, setting the sickly pup aside and preparing for the next one. Seconds later, another puppy arrived identical to the first. The same lesions, the same thin, frail body. One after another, the puppies came, each more disturbing than the last. The smell of sickness filled the air, mixing with the sharp scent of straw and sweat. Clara backed away, her face pale. "This isn't normal," she whispered. This can't be normal." Eliza pressed her lips together, her heart hammering. No, this wasn't normal. This wasn't natural. And deep down, she already knew what it meant. Someone had done this. Maya hadn't just been rescued from an abusive home, she had escaped something much worse. As Eliza wrapped another whimpering pup in a towel, she made a silent vow. Whatever Maya had been through, whatever horrors these puppies had endured before even being born, she would find out the truth. And she would stop whoever was responsible. Eliza Moore had spent most of her life in controlled environments, sterile operating rooms, structured military bases, carefully organized clinics. But the small, quiet town of Ashford was the opposite of everything she had known. The streets were lined with old brick buildings, family-owned shops, and a single diner that seemed to be the heart of the community. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's business, where secrets were hard to keep. Yet, as she had learned in her years of service, the worst things often happened in places that seemed the safest. She had moved here 2 years ago after leaving the military, hoping for peace, but peace had always been a stranger to her. The nightmares still came, the past still clung to her like a shadow, and no matter how hard she tried to disappear into the quiet routine of her new life, trouble had a way of finding her. And tonight, trouble had arrived in the form of a battered German shepherd and her sickly, malformed puppies. Clara Bennett, the young woman standing beside her, was a mystery in her own right. She had moved into the neighborhood only a few months ago, keeping mostly to herself. Eliza had noticed her. Of course, people like them always recognized each other, the ones carrying invisible scars, the ones who flinched at unexpected sounds. But they had never spoken much beyond polite greetings until tonight, when Clara had shown up at her doorstep in tears, begging for help. "I stole her," Clara had admitted in a shaking voice as they rushed to the barn, Maya limping beside them. "I know I shouldn't have, but I couldn't just leave her there." There. That single word carried the weight of something dark, something ugly. Eliza hadn't pushed for details then, there had been no time. But now, as she knelt beside the exhausted dog and examined the frail, suffering puppies, she knew she would have to. The truth was clawing its way to the surface, and she had a sickening feeling that it would be worse than she imagined. "Where exactly did you steal her from?" Eliza asked, keeping her voice level. Clara hesitated, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "A man named Victor Langley," she admitted. "He breeds dogs, but not like normal breeders. I don't know everything, but I've heard things. Fights, dogs disappearing. And I know what I saw, how he treated Maya. She was starving, covered in scars. He was going to kill her. I had to do something." Eliza's stomach tightened at the name. She had heard whispers about Victor Langley since she moved to Ashford, but whispers were all they had ever been. He was wealthy, influential, and dangerous. People didn't talk about him openly, and they certainly didn't cross him. Clara had crossed him. And now, whether she liked it or not, so had Eliza. Before she could respond, the sound of tires crunching against gravel sent a jolt of tension through her. The barn doors were partially open, letting in the moonlight, and in that silvery glow, she saw the unmistakable outline of a truck pulling up to her house. Her blood went cold. "Did anyone see you take her?" she asked sharply. Clara swallowed hard. "I don't know." The engine cut off, and the heavy thud of a car door slamming echoed through the night. Then came footsteps, slow, deliberate. Maya, weak as she was, let out a low growl. Eliza stood, every muscle in her body tensing. A figure appeared at the barn entrance. Tall, broad-shouldered, a presence that carried the weight of unchecked power. Victor Langley. His eyes, sharp and predatory, swept over the scene: the dog, the puppies, Clara's terrified face, Eliza's rigid stance. Then he smiled, a slow, knowing curl of his lips that sent a shiver down Eliza's spine. "I believe you have something of mine," he said. Eliza didn't move, her stance unwavering as Victor Langley took another step forward. The air in the barn had shifted, thick with tension and unspoken threats. Clara's breath hitched beside her, and Maya let out another weak growl, her body trembling but her spirit refusing to break. Victor's eyes flicked to the sickly puppies huddled in the hay, and for a split second, something flickered across his face: annoyance, maybe even recognition, but it was gone just as quickly, replaced by that same unsettling smile. "That dog doesn't belong to you," he said smoothly, his voice carrying the practiced charm of a man used to getting what he wanted. "Hand her over, and I'll forget this little misunderstanding." Eliza crossed her arms, making no move to comply. "She's injured. She needs medical attention." "She's my property," Victor countered, taking another step forward. "And you don't want to make an enemy out of me." Clara sucked in a breath, and Eliza could feel her trembling beside her, but she kept her own expression unreadable. She had dealt with men like Victor before, men who thrived on intimidation, who saw fear as a tool, who believed they were untouchable. The old Eliza, the one who had spent years in war zones, might have met his threat with one of her own. But that part of her was buried deep, locked away with the ghosts she refused to acknowledge. Still, she wasn't about to back down. "If you want her back," she said evenly, "you'll have to go through the legal system. Because right now, this dog is in my care, and I have medical grounds to keep her." Victor's expression darkened, his fingers twitching at his sides as if restraining the urge to lash out. Then, just like that, he exhaled sharply and stepped back, chuckling under his breath. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into, Dr. Moore," he murmured, his tone almost amused. "But you'll find out soon enough." Without another word, he turned and strode out of the barn, his boots crunching against the gravel as he climbed back into his truck. The engine roared to life, and then he was gone, disappearing into the night like a storm retreating just before the downpour. The silence he left behind was deafening. Clara sagged against the barn wall, pressing a shaking hand to her forehead. "Oh my God," she whispered. "He's going to come back, isn't he?" Eliza didn't answer immediately. Instead, she knelt beside Maya again, running a gentle hand over her fur, feeling the subtle tremors beneath her touch. "Probably," she admitted, "but I'm not letting him take her." Clara let out a nervous laugh, the sound brittle. "You really don't scare easily, do you?" Eliza didn't respond. The truth was, fear wasn't the issue. It was what she did with it that mattered. And right now, fear was telling her that she had just made a very dangerous enemy. The next morning, she made the call. James Carter answered on the second ring, his voice groggy. "This better be important." "I need you to meet me at my clinic," Eliza said, already pulling on her jacket. "It's about Victor Langley." That woke him up fast. 20 minutes later, James strode into the clinic, his uniform slightly rumpled, his eyes sharp. He was one of the few honest cops left in Ashford. A man who had spent years walking the fine line between upholding the law and keeping himself from becoming another casualty of the corruption that raw. And deep in the town, Eliza had only met him a handful of times, but she knew enough to trust him more than most. She led him to the back room, where Maya and her puppies were resting. He took one look at them and swore under his breath. "Jesus," he muttered, crouching down to examine the sickly pups. "Where did you find them?" "Clara rescued Maya from Victor's property," Eliza explained. "She was malnourished, injured, and heavily pregnant. These puppies, there's something wrong with them, James. This isn't natural." James ran a hand through his short cropped hair, exhaling sharply. "You realize what you've done, right? Victor isn't the kind of man who lets things slide. He's got people in his pocket, cops, judges, business owners. If he wants to make your life hell, he will. Let him try," Eliza said flatly. James gave her a long look, then shook his head. "You're either the bravest person I've met or the most reckless. Maybe both." James sighed. "All right. I'll see what I can dig up on him. But you need to be careful, Eliza. If Victor decides you're a problem, he won't stop until you're out of his way." She knew that. But as she looked down at Maya, as she saw the way the dog curled protectively around her struggling puppies, she also knew she had no choice. She had already crossed the line. There was no turning back now. Eliza had spent years perfecting the art of staying calm under pressure, but as she sat in her clinic that evening, flipping through medical textbooks and online research on canine genetic mutations, her hands wouldn't stop shaking. The puppies' lesions, their weak immune systems, the way their fur was patchy in places, it all pointed to something deliberate, something engineered. This wasn't just neglect or inbreeding, this was something else entirely. Her gut told her that Victor Langley had been experimenting, but with what and why? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She didn't want to believe that someone could be so cruel, but experience had taught her that people were capable of much worse. A sharp knock at the door yanked her from her thoughts. Her heart jumped, but when she peered through the blinds, she saw James standing outside, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the street like he expected trouble. She let him in without a word. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside and locking the door behind him. "I did some digging, and you're not going to like what I found." Eliza gestured for him to follow her to the back room, where Maya and the puppies lay in a nest of warm blankets. James barely spared them a glance before pulling out his phone and scrolling through what looked like old police reports. "Victor's been under suspicion for years," he muttered. "Illegal breeding, dogfighting, smuggling. But every time someone tries to build a case, the evidence disappears, or witnesses suddenly recant their statements. And here's the kicker, no one's ever been able to figure out where he keeps his dogs. There's no official breeding facility, no warehouse, nothing on paper." Eliza frowned. "So, where the hell is he keeping them?" James hesitated, then zoomed in on an aerial map. "I think I found it." He turned the screen toward her, showing an isolated property on the outskirts of town, hidden deep in the woods. No listed owner, no official address, but there have been reports of deliveries heading that way, large quantities of raw meat, medical supplies, cages. Someone's running an operation out there, and my guess is, it's Victor. Eliza studied the map, her mind already racing ahead. If he's keeping dogs there, they're suffering. We need proof. James gave her a pointed look. "You're not thinking of going out there alone, are you?" "What choice do I have?" she countered. "You just said no one's been able to pin anything on him. If we don't act fast, he'll move everything before we can do a damn thing about it." James exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. "You are going to get yourself killed." "Then I guess I'd better make it count," she said. James cursed under his breath, pacing the room while Eliza remained seated, her gaze steady. She knew the risks. Hell, she had lived through worse. But she also knew that waiting around would only give Victor time to cover his tracks, and if he realized she was onto him, the dogs, whatever was left of them, would be gone. James stopped pacing, exhaling slowly. "If you're dead set on doing this, we do it my way. No heroics. We go together, we stay out of sight, and we get the evidence we need without getting caught." Eliza raised an eyebrow. "That almost sounds like you're volunteering." "Damn right I am," James muttered. "Someone's got to make sure you don't do anything stupid." A small smirk played on Eliza's lips, but she didn't argue. She wasn't reckless, at least, not in the way people assumed. She planned, she calculated risks, and she always had an exit strategy. It was a skill set that had kept her alive in war zones, and it was going to keep her alive now. They spent the next hour preparing. James gathered surveillance equipment, small, motion-triggered cameras, an old night vision scope, and a police-issue radio he had borrowed from the station. Eliza packed a first aid kit, gloves, and a compact flashlight. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. Claire arrived just as they were going over their approach. The moment she saw the gear, her eyes widened. "You're really doing this," she whispered. "You're going to his property?" "We need proof," Eliza said simply. "If we don't have solid evidence, the cops won't touch him." Clara hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Then I'm coming with you." James shot her a sharp look. "Absolutely not. You need a lookout," Clara insisted. "Someone to stay behind, watch your backs, and call for help if something goes wrong." Eliza considered her for a moment, then nodded. "She's right. We'll need a second pair of eyes." James swore again but didn't argue. They had no time for debates. The plan was set. An hour later, they were deep in the woods, moving silently through the underbrush. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, the sounds of crickets and distant owls that only noise around them. The property loomed ahead, barely visible through the trees, a massive, fenced-in compound, its perimeter lined with floodlights and security cameras. Eliza's gut twisted. Whatever Victor was doing here, he didn't want anyone to see it. James tapped her shoulder, nodding toward a side gate. "That's our way in," he murmured. Eliza took a steadying breath, her fingers tightening around the camera in her pocket. This was it. No turning back now. Eliza pressed herself against the rough bark of a tree, her breath steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. The compound was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. She scanned the perimeter, noting the placement of cameras and the rotation of the lone guard patrolling near the main gate. James crouched beside her, his expression grim as he lifted his night vision scope. "This place is locked down tight," he murmured. "We'll have to be fast." Eliza nodded, glancing over her shoulder where Clara was hidden a safe distance away, perched on a small ridge with her phone at the ready. She had strict orders: if anything went wrong, she was to call the police and disappear. Eliza wasn't about to put another innocent person in danger. "We move now," she whispered, and without hesitation, she and James slipped through the trees, keeping to the shadows. The fence was their first obstacle, a solid 8 feet high topped with razor wire. But someone as paranoid as Victor Langley wasn't going to rely on just a fence. Eliza's instincts screamed that there were additional security measures: pressure sensors, motion detectors, things designed to keep people both in and out. James seemed to reach the same conclusion. He pointed to a small utility box near the base of the fence, its panel slightly ajar. "Security system," he muttered. "Give me a minute." Eliza kept watch as James worked quickly, disabling the sensors without triggering an alarm. When he gave a nod, she climbed the fence with practiced ease, landing silently on the other side. James followed, and within seconds, they were inside. The compound was larger than she had expected. Several large kennels lined one side of the property, each covered in heavy tarps, the occasional movement from within the only sign of life. A large warehouse loomed ahead, its doors locked with heavy chains. The air smelled of blood, decay, and something sickly sweet that turned Eliza's stomach. She knew that smell. "Rot. This is worse than I thought," James whispered, his grip tightening on the camera in his hands. They moved toward the kennels first. Eliza carefully lifted the edge of a tarp, her heart clenching at the sight beneath. Dogs. Dozens of them. Some were curled into tight balls, their ribs jutting out beneath mangy fur, their eyes hollow and lifeless. Others flinched at the slightest movement, their bodies scarred and broken. One let out a low, pitiful whimper, and Eliza felt something inside her snap. "We have to get them out," she hissed. "Not yet," James said, pulling her back. "We need proof first." Eliza gritted her teeth but nodded. They couldn't blow their cover. Not yet. They moved toward the warehouse next, James slipping a small camera through a gap in the doors to record whatever was inside. But before they could move farther, a voice cut through the darkness. Well, a slow, mocking drawl echoed across the yard. "Looks like we have ourselves some trespassers." Eliza's pulse spiked as she turned slowly, her muscles coiled and ready. Victor Langley stood a few yards away, flanked by 2 men built like human walls. He looked relaxed, hands in his pockets, a smirk curling his lips, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. the kind of man who enjoyed the slow unraveling of control in his prey. James tensed beside her, his fingers twitching toward his belt, but they both knew they were outmatched. Victor tilted his head, feigning curiosity. Now, what could possibly bring a cop and a veterinarian to my property in the middle of the night? His gaze flickered to the kennels, then to the warehouse behind them, his smirk widening. Looking for something. Eliza kept her breathing steady, her mind racing through possible exits. They had gotten in quietly, but getting out would be a different story. The moment she or James made a move, those men would be on them, and she doubted Victor would be feeling particularly merciful. We saw the reports, James said, his voice even. Missing dogs, shipments that don't add up. We thought we'd take a look. Victor chuckled, shaking his head. And here I thought you were smarter than that, Carter. You think sneaking in here with a little camera is going to change anything? You think anyone in this town is going to believe you over me? He took a step closer, his presence suffocating. You don't understand how things work here. People like me don't get caught. People like me don't lose. Eliza clenched her jaw, anger simmering beneath her skin. That's what they all think, she said. Right up until the moment they do. Victor's smile faded slightly, his amusement thinning. Brave words, Doctor. But let's see how brave you are when you're the one locked up like an animal. He snapped his fingers. His men lunged. Eliza reacted instantly. She ducked as one of them reached for her, driving her elbow into his ribs before pivoting and slamming the heel of her boot into his knee. He stumbled, cursing, but she had no time to celebrate the small victory. The second man was already on James, and Victor, damn him, was just watching, enjoying the show. James grunted as he took a punch to the stomach but twisted free, slamming his fist into his attacker's throat. The men reeled back, choking, but there was no time to catch their breath. More footsteps pounded toward them from the main house. Reinforcements. Too many. Eliza locked eyes with James. They had seconds before they were overrun. Run, he ordered. Now. She didn't hesitate. She spun, sprinting for the fence, the sound of shouts and heavy boots pounding against the dirt behind her. James was right beside her, matching her pace, their only goal now survival. The first gunshot cracked the air just as they reached the fence. Eliza hit the ground hard as the bullet whizzed past her, kicking up a spray of dirt where her foot had been a second earlier. James grabbed her arm, yanking her behind a stack of old crates near the fence line as another shot rang out. Damn it, he muttered, pulling his service pistol from its holster. They're not just trying to scare us. Eliza's heart pounded, but she forced herself to focus. She could hear Victor shouting orders in the distance, his voice dripping with frustration. He hadn't expected them to put up a fight. Good. That meant he was getting sloppy. We have to get out of here before more of them show up, she said, scanning the fence for their best exit. James nodded. On my mark, we run for that gap near the tree line. Got it. Eliza tightened her grip on the small camera in her pocket. The footage they had captured could end Victor's reign of terror, but only if they made it out alive. She gave a sharp nod. Got it. James took a breath, then sprang up, firing two quick shots toward the men advancing on them. They ducked, giving Eliza the opening she needed. She bolted, her legs burning as she sprinted toward the fence. James was right behind her. More gunfire erupted, but the darkness was on their side. They reached the gap just as another shot shattered the bark of a nearby tree. James shoved her forward. Go? Eliza scrambled through the opening, hitting the ground and rolling to absorb the impact. She turned just in time to see James vault through after her. But before he could land, a pair of hands grabbed his leg, yanking him backward. No, Eliza lunged, grabbing his wrist. Their eyes met, and for a split second, she saw the same determination in his that she felt in her own. Run, James gritted out. Not happening, Eliza snapped. With a furious snarl, she kicked out at the man holding James, her boot connecting with his face. The impact was enough to make him loosen his grip, just enough for James to wrench free. They didn't stop. They didn't look back. They ran. The sound of angry voices and barking dogs faded as they plunged deeper into the woods. Branches clawed at Eliza's arms, but she barely felt it. Her only focus was moving forward, putting as much distance as possible between them and the hell they had just escaped. After what felt like an eternity, they finally slowed, gasping for breath. James doubled over, hands on his knees. Tell me we got what we needed." Eliza pulled the camera from her pocket, her fingers trembling. She clicked through the footage, the kennels, the tortured dogs, the illegal operation in full view. It was all there, evidence that no one could ignore. She looked at James, her chest heaving. "We got him." James exhaled, running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair, his body still tense from the chase. "Then we don't stop moving. We get this to the station, now." Eliza nodded, swallowing down the lingering adrenaline as they pushed forward through the dense forest, every step a battle against exhaustion. Their breaths came in sharp bursts, the night air thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, but they didn't dare slow down. Victor wouldn't let this go. If they stopped, if they hesitated, he would find them. They reached the roadside just as headlights flashed in the distance. For one terrible second, Eliza thought it was one of Victor's men, but then a familiar old sedan skidded to a stop in front of them. Clara leaned across the passenger seat, her face pale. "Get in." They barely had time to slam the doors before she hit the gas, the tires kicking up gravel as they sped toward town. "What happened?" she demanded, gripping the wheel like it was the only thing keeping her from losing control. "We got the evidence," Eliza said, clutching the camera like a lifeline. "And we nearly got killed for it." James twisted in his seat, scanning the road behind them. "They're not following us. Yet." Clara's knuckles whitened. "You think Victor's just going to let you walk away with proof that could ruin him?" Eliza shook her head. "No, but he won't be able to stop what's coming next." As soon as they reached the station, James yanked the car into park and sprinted inside. Eliza followed, her heart hammering as she burst into the lobby. Officers turned to stare, but James ignored them, heading straight for the one person who mattered, Captain Holloway. He was an old-school cop, gruff and skeptical, but if anyone had the authority to take Victor down, it was him. James dropped the camera onto his desk. "Watch this." Holloway frowned but said nothing as he clicked play. The room went silent as the footage unfolded: dogs in cages, their eyes hollow with suffering, scars mapping their bodies, Victor's men moving through the compound like guards in a prison. When the screen finally went dark, Holloway leaned back, his face unreadable. Then he picked up his phone. "Get me a warrant," he barked. "And assemble a team." Eliza felt the tension in her chest ease, just slightly. It wasn't over yet, but the tides had turned. An hour later, they were back in the squad cars, sirens cutting through the night. As the convoy tore down the road toward Victor's compound, Eliza met James's gaze. No words were needed. This was it. The endgame. The moment justice finally caught up with Victor Langley. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the darkness as the police convoy reached Victor Langley's compound. Officers poured out, weapons drawn, their movements precise and rehearsed. James led the charge, barking orders as they breached the perimeter. The barking of terrified dogs mixed with the shouts of officers and the crackling of police radios. Eliza stood back, her heart pounding as she watched the raid unfold. For months, Victor had operated with impunity, believing himself untouchable. But tonight, that illusion shattered. A furious snarl echoed from the main house, followed by a crash. Victor burst through the front door, his face twisted with rage as he took in the swarm of officers flooding his property. He made a break for his truck, but two officers tackled him to the ground before he could reach it. He fought viciously, roaring in protest, but it was over. James yanked him up by the collar, shoving him against the squad car. "You think this changes anything?" Victor spat, his lip curling in disgust. "You think one night and does everything I built?" James didn't flinch. "No," he said, "but it's a damn good start." Eliza turned away from Victor, focusing on what truly mattered. Officers were already cutting the locks off the kennels, guiding the weak and frightened dogs into the waiting animal rescue trucks. Some of the dogs shrank back, too traumatized to move, while others whimpered as gentle hands lifted them into crates lined with blankets. She moved toward them, her medical bag already in hand. One by one, she examined the dogs, checking for broken bones, infected wounds, signs of starvation. She felt a lump in her throat as she reached the last kennel, a trembling shepherd mix, barely more than a pup. It reminded her so much of Maya, and for a brief moment, she felt the weight of everything settle over her. Clara appeared beside her, reaching out a hand to the pup, who hesitated before inching forward, pressing its damp nose into her palm. "We did it," Clara whispered. They're safe now. Eliza let out a slow breath. Yeah, she said, watching as another truck rolled in to transport the rescued animals to shelters. We did, but the fight wasn't over. 2 weeks later, Eliza stood in front of the empty barn, now cleared of the makeshift whelping area where Maya had given birth. The town had rallied behind the case, donations pouring in to support the rescued animals. Victor was being held without bail, facing a long list of charges that wouldn't be disappearing this time. But as Eliza looked out over the open field behind her property, she felt the familiar itch of restlessness. She had spent so long running, avoiding attachments, keeping herself at arm's length from everything and everyone. But that night, standing beside James and Clara, watching those dogs take their first steps toward freedom, something had shifted inside her. So when Clara appeared with a wooden sign, the letters carefully painted in bold, steady strokes, Eliza didn't hesitate. She ran her fingers over the smooth surface, reading the words aloud. Moore's Haven, a sanctuary, Clara said softly. For dogs like Maya. For all the ones who need a second chance. Eliza exhaled slowly. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like something to outrun. It felt like something worth building. She looked at Clara, then at James, who leaned against the fence with a knowing smile. All right, she said. Let's get to work.